Hello, my name is Sam, and I'm the host of the YouTube channel Sam Aronow. But today, I'm guest narrating for Useful Charts in order to show you the family tree of the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasties, the two dynasties that ruled the Kingdom of Judea during the Hellenistic and early Roman periods. I'll be starting with the Maccabees, who are the main characters in the Hanukkah story and the starting point of the Hasmonean dynasty. I'll then be tracing their line to the point in which it connects to Herod the Great, who, according to the Christian Gospels, was the king of Judea when Jesus was born. Finally, I'll be looking at the various descendants of Herod, some of whom continue to impact history far into the Roman period. This video is part of Useful Chart series on biblical genealogy, so if you're interested in watching the other parts as well, you can find a link to those in the description. The previous video in this series ended with the fall of the Kingdom of Judah to the Babylonians in 586 BCE. At that point, the original Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews were exiled to Babylon. But when Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon, he allowed the Jews to return home. The grandson of a former high priest named Joshua and the grandson of a former king named Zerubbabel teamed up to lead the return and to start the process of building a new temple. If we zoom ahead several hundred years to around 200 BCE, we find that the descendants of Joshua are still serving as high priests, and that, in particular, the title is now held by a family known as the Oneids. But by this point, the foreign power controlling Judea has changed, and it is now the Greek Seleucids who are in charge. However, not all Jews were happy with the increased Hellenization promoted by the Seleucids, and things finally came to a breaking point when the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes shut down the Jewish temple in 167. At this point, the Oneids fled to Egypt and built another temple there, while a member of a different priestly family, named Mattathias, launched a resistance movement in Judea in the hopes of achieving Jewish independence. Eventually, Mattathias' son Judah Maccabee recaptured Jerusalem from the Seleucids and reconsecrated the Jewish temple, a story that today is remembered through the holiday of Hanukkah. Judah thus became the first high priest of the Hasmonean dynasty. Note that the name Maccabee, while often applied to all of Mattathias' son, was actually just a nickname held by Judah only. In English, it means the hammer, HaMaccabee. So the name of the dynasty is not the Maccabean dynasty, it's the Hasmonean dynasty named after their ancestor Asmoneus. Judah Maccabee was actually killed in combat before the end of the revolt, and the high priesthood went to another family for a while before returning to the Hasmoneans in 153, when it was given to Judah's younger brother Jonathan Apphus, and then later to their brother Simon Tassi, who also proclaimed himself Prince of Judea. In 134, Simon was assassinated along with his two eldest sons, so both positions fell to his youngest son, John. John had been raised in the expectation that he would never have any power, so he began his rule woefully unprepared, but eventually rose to secure full independence for Judea and lead a number of conquests against the now collapsing Seleucid Empire, taking the regnal name Hyrcanus I. Hyrcanus' son, Aristobulus I, continued these conquests, but created some major political problems when he crowned himself king of Judea rather than prince. This is because, according to the biblical book of Numbers, there needed to be a strict separation between the crown and the high priesthood. Aristobulus died less than a year after taking power, but the issue of crown and temple would haunt the Hasmonean dynasty for a long time, as we'll see. Originally, Aristobulus had willed his titles to his brother Antigonus, but Antigonus was killed in a coup led by Aristobulus' wife Salome Alexandra, who, after Aristobulus' death, married Aristobulus' younger brother Alexander. However, Alexander was an unpopular tyrant who caused a civil war, and while he and his allied political party, the Sadducees, won that civil war, their victory was rapidly undone in a soft coup by Salome and her allies the Pharisees, which ended up with Salome as the real power behind the throne. When Alexander died in 76, Salome was crowned as Queen Alexandra, and it was under her that Judea reached its peak of power and prestige. Under Alexandra's reign, the high priesthood was reformed from a purely hereditary position to an elected one, though one still had to be of priestly blood to be eligible, and the position was given to her eldest son Hyrcanus II, with her younger son Aristobulus II to become king. thus separating the crown and the priesthood. However, this ended up not happening, because Aristobulus was an ally of the now marginalized Sadducees. So another civil war erupted, in which Hyrcanus II ruled as king and high priest for a year before being overthrown by Aristobulus. This war quickly ground to a stalemate, which was finally broken by the Roman leader Pompey the Great. Under Pompey's supervision, the monarchy was suspended in order to finally deal with the succession and separation of powers. Hyrcanus II was reinstalled as high priest and given the title ethnarch, and his daughter married Aristobulus' son in order to reunite the two sides in the civil war. As luck would have it, their first child was a daughter, Mariamne the Hasmonean, who as a woman was ineligible to be high priest, thus finally separating the crown and the priesthood. However, Mariamne would never be queen in her own right. In order to fight in the civil war, Hyrcanus II had relied on the leadership of a general named Antipater the Idumean, who then arranged a marriage between Mariamne and his son Herod. When the Parthians briefly invaded the eastern Mediterranean and installed Mariamne's uncle Antigonus Mattathias as a puppet ruler, Herod and Mariamne fled to Rome, where, due to his friendship with Mark Antony, Herod was crowned as king of Judea. Herod and Mariamne had two sons, Aristobulus and Alexander, but as Herod fell deeper into paranoia, he eventually had Mariamne executed, later followed by Aristobulus and Alexander, as well as all known Hasmoneans. The only Hasmoneans he couldn't get to were Aristobulus and Alexander's children, about whom we'll discuss more in a moment. Herod had several more wives and produced a very large number of children, but today he is mostly remembered for two things. First, he undertook a major renovation and expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and in fact the only part of the Jewish temple that still exists today is a section that was added by Herod. That section is known as the Western Wall, or Wailing Wall. The second thing he's often associated with is the Massacre of the Innocents, an event that is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, but for which there is no evidence outside the New Testament. According to the story, Herod was visited by 3 wise men from the east, who had come to Jerusalem because the stars had told them that a new king of the Jews had just been born in the nearby town of Bethlehem. In order to avoid a potential usurper, Herod had all the male children under the age of 2 living nearby killed. Again, this event is not recorded anywhere other than the Gospel of Matthew, and most historians consider it a myth. After the death of Herod in 4 BCE, his kingdom was divided into 4 parts and ruled as a tetrarchy. The tetrarchs included Herod's sister Salome, who ruled the coastal region of Yavne until her death in 10 CE, and 3 of Herod's sons. Archelaus ruled Judea proper before abdicating in order to marry a non-Jewish wife. Philip ruled Batanea, the modern-day Golan Heights, until his death in 34, and eventually only Antipas was left ruling the Galilee and Perea. It is Antipas who is the second Herod mentioned in the Christian Gospels. In other words, in the New Testament, he is simply called Herod instead of Herod Antipas, which is a bit confusing because he's actually the son of the first Herod who is mentioned, Herod the Great. Anyway, there's a story in the Gospels involving a woman named Herodias, who in real life was the granddaughter of Herod's sister Salome. She was originally married to another one of Herod's sons, known as Herod II, or Herod Bethus. But they divorced, and she then married his brother Herod Antipas. In the Gospel account, Herodias convinces Antipas to have John the Baptist killed because John the Baptist did not approve of her new marriage, and famously, the head of John the Baptist gets delivered to her at the wedding feast. Let's now go back to Herod and Mariamne's grandchildren. They had been sent off as children to be raised in the imperial court in Rome, which is why they survived. And one of them, Marcus Julius Agrippa, eventually won over the favor of Emperor Caligula and deposed his uncle Antipas to become king of the Galilee, Batanea, and Perea. Not long after, when Caligula was assassinated, Agrippa supported the accession of Caligula's uncle Claudius, who rewarded Agrippa by restoring independence for all of Judea. This Agrippa, known to historians as Agrippa I, is the third of the 3 Herods mentioned in the Christian New Testament, where he shows up in the book of Acts as the Herod who imprisons the Apostle Peter. Agrippa was in poor health and eventually died of kidney failure, at which point Judea reverted to a Roman province while his son, Agrippa II, was allowed to stay on as a symbolic figurehead for the Jewish people. Agrippa II also shows up in the book of Acts, where he is simply called Agrippa. Unfortunately, Agrippa II was very unpopular within Judea for being an absentee ruler who always sided with the Romans in disputes, while anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire was becoming a big problem. So when the Jewish people revolted in 66 CE, Agrippa fled the country, and the rebels quickly established a republic. This is considered the end of the Herodian dynasty. However, the Herodian-Hasmonean line had many survivors who continued after the war, and that is what we will explore next. After the First Jewish-Roman War, the dynasty split into 4 distinct branches. First, we'll talk about the Armenian branch. Agrippa I's cousin, Tigranes, eventually became King Tigranes V of Armenia, and then that king's nephew became Tigranes VI. This branch's descendants did not stay on as Armenia's royal family, though, due to a war of succession that eventually turned into a major conflict between the Roman and Parthian empires. Tigranes' descendants are also not considered Jewish because his children were by a non-Jewish queen. However, they are notable in that Tigranes' great-great-grandson, Avidius Cassius, in the year 175 proclaimed himself Roman emperor and attempted to overthrow Marcus Aurelius. His grandmother, Cassiolepida, was also a direct descendant of Augustus Caesar. Cassius obviously failed in this attempt, and he was killed along with his children, ending the Armenian branch of the Herodian dynasty. With that out of the way, let's talk about the Etrurian branch, as they had the best claim to be the successors to Judea. When Agrippa I became king of Judea, he separated a small mountainous region called Etruria to serve as a kingdom for his older brother, Herod of Chalkis. Herod of Chalkis's eldest son, Aristobulus of Chalkis, inherited this role, but interestingly later abdicated to become king of the short-lived state of Armenia Minor. Herod of Chalkis also married Agrippa I's daughter, Julia Berenike. When Agrippa II died childless in 92 CE, his lands were inherited by Herod and Julia's surviving granddaughter, Julia Crispina, who served as caretaker of Jewish lands and was a fairly influential figure in Jewish society after the destruction of the temple. But Julia Crispina died around the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt and ensuing Hadrianic persecutions, which was the first of the 4 major historical genocides against the Jewish people, and we can assume that she had no heirs. This brings us to the Italian branch, which was the shortest lived. Agrippa II's youngest sister, Drusilla, married Antonius Felix, the Roman governor of Judea at the time. After he left his post, they settled in the city of Pompeii, which was becoming a major center for free Jewish slaves after the First Jewish-Roman War. But Drusilla and her children were killed in the famous eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Finally, we reach the Egyptian branch. This branch was created when Agrippa II's sister Mariamne married Demetrius, the Alabarch of Egypt. The Alabarch was the term for the manager of the port of Alexandria, and this was a hereditary position held by a specific Jewish family dating back to the Hellenistic period. Remember the Oneids that were mentioned at the beginning of this video? The ones who escaped to Egypt and built their own temple? Well, they were eventually replaced with a different priestly family who became known as the Alabarchs of Alexandria. This family included the well-known Alexander the Alabarch, who was extremely wealthy and was close friends with Emperor Claudius. Perhaps more well-known, though, is his brother Philo, who is one of the most famous Jewish philosophers of all time, and in fact one of the most important philosophers of the early Roman period in general. His nephew, named Tiberius Julius Alexander, became a Roman general and abandoned Judaism. He went on to help lead the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. It's not clear how Demetrius is connected to these other well-known figures, but it is likely that he was closely related somehow. What we do know is that the position of Alabarch far outlasted the 3 major Jewish-Roman wars, and although we don't know the exact details, some early Christian documents mention the last known Alabarch as being a man named Anastasius, who probably served during the Severan dynasty of Roman emperors, who were notable for their much more favorable treatment of Jews. If there are any direct descendants of the Herodian dynasty today, they are likely descended through this Egyptian branch, which would also make them heirs to the Hasmonean dynasty and the Alabarchy. The only major expulsion of Jews from Egypt took place in the 20th century, so if your last name is Cohen and your father's family came from Egypt, you have a good chance of being a lost heir to the kings of Judea. However, while some religious Jews are monarchists, there is no movement in Judaism supporting a Herodian or Hasmonean restoration. After the First Jewish-Roman War, the Sadducees, who supported the Herodian dynasty, faded from the Jewish political and religious spectrum, and all subsequent royalist or messianic claims have had to come from the Davidic dynasty. If you are interested in learning more about these people, or Jewish history in general, you can find even more details about what I talked about in this video on my channel, Sam Aronow, which is linked in the description. Thanks to Useful Charts for letting me host, and thanks to all of you for watching.